The man you see in this photograph was a hero who came from thousands of miles away and forever changed the lives of children he had never met. But what if I told you that this soldier's sacrifice didn't just change one child's life, but completely altered the fate of 15 different families?
Don't you want to know who this soldier was and why he risked his life for children he had never known? If you have a similar family story, send it to our email address in the description and we'll share it in our videos.
My name is Tommy Weber. I'm 85 years old now, and I want to tell you about the miracle I experienced on those cold winter days 73 years ago. Back then, I was just 12 years old, so thin you could count my bones, a child with gray eyes constantly filled with fear. My hair was blonde, but it was so dirty and messy at the time that it almost looked brown. I was shorter than my peers and always cold because the only clothes I had were a torn sweater and pants with patches on the knees. It was February 1945. I was living in an orphanage set up among the ruins of a bombed church in Rothenburg, a small town in Germany. The war hadn't ended yet, but since the fronts were getting closer, we could hear cannon fire every night. What I called an orphanage was actually a half-destroyed building. Half of its roof was gone, cardboard pieces replaced glass in the windows, and winter wind would seep through the holes in the walls. There were 14 other children with me. Our youngest was 3-year-old Hans, and our oldest was 17-year-old Greta. Greta was a tall girl with black hair. Her face always looked serious because she tried to act like our mother. Her hands were constantly calloused from work, and there was always authority in her voice. We had no one else to take care of us because our only adult, Sister Catherine, was very sick. Sister Catherine Murphy was a nun of Irish descent. She was about 28 years old, with curly red hair, green eyes, and was very kind. But she had become very ill that winter. She coughed constantly and had a fever. We children worried about her because she was also part of our family. We would hear her coughing in the middle of the night and try to help her. At that time, we had almost no food. We ate one meal a day, usually a flour mixture mixed with water. Most nights we went to bed hungry and had become accustomed to hearing our stomachs rumbling in the mornings. It was the 3rd week of February. It was snowing and the temperature had dropped to -15 degrees. That night we had gone to bed hungry again. Little Hans was crying because he was so hungry. Sister Catherine was coughing again and had a very high fever. It was past 4 in the morning when we heard vehicle sounds from outside. At first we were frightened because the war was still going on and unknown vehicles always meant danger. When we looked outside through the cardboard at the window, we saw a military truck with American markings. A large man got out of the truck. This was Sergeant Michael Harrison, but at the time we only knew he was an American soldier. He was about 35 years old, broad-shouldered, with strong hands. His hair was brown and he had a benevolent expression on his face, but what I remember most were his eyes. He had blue eyes, and there was very deep compassion in those eyes. It was as if he could feel our pain. When Sergeant Harrison entered the orphanage, we had all been startled. But he moved very slowly and raised his hand in the air, trying to show that he wasn't dangerous to us. He could speak German, but his pronunciation was a bit strange. When he approached us, he said, "Don't be afraid, I came to help you." The first thing he saw was us shivering on rags that served as beds. Then he saw Sister Catherine. The nun was so sick she could barely stand. Sergeant Harrison immediately approached her and checked her forehead. I could see the worried expression on his face. The sergeant went back and brought a large bag from his truck. This bag contained canned food, blankets, and medicines. The first thing he did was give medicine to Sister Catherine. Then he gave each of us a canned food. Those cans contained beef, and it was the most delicious thing I had ever tasted in my life. But Sergeant Harrison's real plan was different. He wasn't going to leave us there and go away. He told us about the United States of America. He said there were safe homes there, plenty of food, and that we could get an education. Of course, it was hard to believe these things could be real at that moment, because we had been experiencing only hunger, cold, and fear for so long. Sergeant Harrison's plan regarding us was very dangerous. There was no official orphan evacuation program like this, but he had decided to save us on his own initiative. For him to do this, he had to act against military rules, and if he was caught, he could be tried in a military court. He stayed with us for 3 days. He made the orphanage as livable as possible. He covered the holes in the roof, put plastic on the windows, and set up a temporary stove for us. But his real purpose was to get us out of there. On the 4th day, he gave us his big news. He had found a way to take us to the United States of America. But for this, we needed to travel with his truck and go to America by sea. Sister Catherine's condition had gotten much worse. Sergeant Harrison told her she needed to go to the hospital, but the nun didn't want to leave us. Finally, the sergeant convinced her and took Sister Catherine to a nearby hospital. When he returned from there, he said it was time for us to prepare for the journey. I didn't sleep at all that night, because my life was about to change completely. I was leaving this ruined orphanage, the only place I knew, to go to a country I had never known. I was scared but also excited. Early in the morning, Sergeant Harrison's truck came. This time the truck was much bigger and warm blankets were spread in the back. We all got on the truck. I sat by the window and looked at the orphanage one last time. That decayed, cold building had been our home for the last few months, but now it was being left behind. The journey took 12 hours. Sergeant Harrison constantly checked whether we were okay. Throughout the journey, he told us stories about America. He talked about big cities and schools. He especially told me about the sport of baseball. In the evening, we arrived at Hamburg port. There was a big ship there, and it was going to the United States of America. But there was no reservation for us on the ship. Sergeant Harrison had to talk with the officials at length to get us on the ship. We waited for hours. Sergeant Harrison was constantly dealing with paperwork, trying to find a place for us. At 11 at night he came back. He had a big smile on his face. He had found a place for us on the ship, but he had given most of his salary. When I first saw the ship, I was very impressed. It was so big that I couldn't see where it ended. It was a cargo ship called Liberty Star. Our place was downstairs, in a large hall. Sergeant Harrison, after settling us in our cabin, sat next to us and said something very important. He said to me, "Tommy, you are now the big brother. You will need to help the other children because this journey won't be easy." At that moment, even though I was 12 years old, I felt very adult. The ship journey lasted 9 days. The first 3 days were calm, but then we were caught in a storm. The ship was swaying so much that we were all breaking from nausea. Sergeant Harrison was constantly with us during this time. On the 5th day of the storm, little Hans became very ill. He had a high fever and was having trouble breathing. Sergeant Harrison took him to the ship's doctor. We waited for hours. Thankfully Hans recovered, but Sergeant had given his own money for his treatment. On the morning of the 9th day, the ship's horn sounded. When we went up on deck, we saw a large coastline in the distance. It was the east coast of the United States of America. We could see the silhouette of New York City. The moment I first saw the Statue of Liberty was a moment I will never forget in my life. When we arrived at Ellis Island, there was a very large crowd. Thousands of people were waiting and being examined to enter America. Our situation was a bit different because we were orphaned children and Sergeant Harrison had become our guardian. We waited for hours at the immigration office. Sergeant Harrison was constantly dealing with paperwork, talking to officials. Finally, we were allowed to enter America. But the condition was this: Sergeant Harrison would be our temporary guardian and American families would be found for us. From New York, we went to Ohio State by train. This was Columbus, the city where Sergeant Harrison's house was located. On the train, I saw American landscapes for the first time. There were such wide lands, such green fields that I couldn't believe my eyes. When we arrived in Columbus, Sergeant Harrison's wife Margaret was waiting for us. Margaret was about 32 years old, with brown hair, a very cheerful woman. She welcomed us all with hugs and took us to their home. Sergeant Harrison's house was more beautiful than I could have imagined in my dreams. It was a 2-story, white-painted house with a small garden in front. The inside was warm and clean. Margaret made us warm meals: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. That night I slept in real beds and felt safe for the first time. In the following weeks, Sergeant Harrison began to find families who wanted to adopt us. This process was very difficult because none of us wanted to be separated from each other. But this was necessary for us to build a better life in America. Greta was the first to leave. An elderly couple living in Michigan State adopted her. We cried a lot when Greta left because she was our big sister, then little Hans, then the others. We were separating one by one. The family that adopted me was the Johnson family living in Ohio. They were Robert and Helen Johnson couple. Robert was a worker in a factory. Helen was a housewife. They had no children, and they loved me very much. They gave me the name Thomas, but I always preferred to remain as Tommy. The years I spent with the Johnson family were the most beautiful years of my life. I went to school, learned English, made friends. Robert taught me to play baseball. Helen taught me to make American food. I had a real family. But I never forgot Sergeant Harrison. We corresponded with him for years. He constantly asked me how I was and gave news about the other children. Most of those children had become very successful too. Some became doctors, some engineers, some teachers. I last saw Sergeant Harrison in 1963. He was about to go to the Vietnam War then. I had told him how grateful I was to him. He had said to me, "Tommy, you were already a strong child. I just gave you an opportunity." Sergeant Harrison returned from Vietnam but had changed a lot. The war had affected him greatly. He died of a heart attack in 1975. I attended his funeral, and 13 of the 15 children he had saved were there. All of us had built lives thanks to him.
Tommy Weber's story is the best example of how one person's sacrifice can change dozens of lives. Sergeant Michael Harrison, ignoring his military career and his own safety, saved the future of children he had never known. Today, most of those 15 children are alive and all of them have children, even grandchildren. This means that Sergeant Harrison's brave decision has touched the lives of hundreds of people. This is true heroism, putting aside one's own interests and making sacrifices for the good of others.